Good afternoon, and welcome to this regular meeting of the Education and Neighborhoods Committee. This is Wednesday, December 8th, 2010. The time is 3:34, and I'm Paul Krikorian, the chair of the committee. I am not joined yet by my colleagues on the committee, and I do not expect to be. They had other engagements today and will probably not be able to make it, so we're going to be proceeding now. And let's go right into the first item on the agenda.
Item number one is the communications. Is communications from the city clerk, city attorney, Department of Neighborhood Empowerment relative to an after-action report for the 2010 Neighborhood Council Board elections and recommendations for the administration of future Neighborhood Council elections.
And we have our clerk with us today, Ms. Lagme. Welcome. This is a continuing conversation that we've been having of your analysis of what went well and what could be done differently in the neighborhood council elections that were run by the city clerk's office. I appreciate the continuing input that you've provided, and I know we had a number of questions last time for follow-up, particularly on cost, and you've done some additional analysis, I understand, since the last meeting. So I'd like to invite you to go ahead and present that additional reporting, and we will take it from there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just as a general overview, we have presented before the committee several times about the whole experience of conducting those elections. It was a challenge. It was hard work. I guess I would make it analogous to the engineering involved laying a road through a mountain pass. We tried to make it as straight and direct as possible, but a lot of our resources and effort was in moving boulders, laying concrete. That being said, we do not anticipate that if the clerk were to run elections for the neighborhood councils in the future, that it would be the same experience any way, shape, or form. Because, as I said, a lot of that which we did the first time does not need to be duplicated. We have the systems in place. We have the basic forms in place. We have a general familiarity in place. The road is in place. This allows us the luxury of having more communication, which we want to do, with the neighborhood councils to find little routes in and out and across the road, but still leading in the same direction so that everyone does not have to be in lockstep. Did we do a good job? I feel that my staff were exemplary. Were we perfect? No. Could we do better? Absolutely. So at this point, I'm simply going to quote some figures at you. The reason why is until such time as the mayor and council rescind the ordinance on the books that charges the clerk to run elections, we're obligated to keep putting it forward in our budget, which we will be uber responsible to do. So if we were to conduct the elections for neighborhood councils in 2012 exactly as we did them this past year, we're talking about 1.4 mil. However, we do not want to do them exactly the same way, and I'm sure you don't want us either, and I know that the NCs don't either. We strongly recommend the add-on option of additional $136,000. This will allow us to hire a total of 9 regional communication coordinators. This would allow us to hire people who are not existing city staff to be assigned to each of the 9 regions to be sort of like a key coordinator, follow-up person, the go-to guy or gal if paperwork isn't returned on time or people don't show up for meetings. And it will have a much more personal feel and give a face so that neighborhood councils have a trusted person that they can interface with.
This would be, the anticipation of this would be to be the principal contact person leading up to the election,
yes.
in the months prior to the election.
It is not outreach. It's
but it doesn't include outreach. It's
correct.
Purely the logistics of the election, to have a regional point person
yes.
who would be able to be the ombudsperson, essentially.
Yes, exactly. So I think for the added price of $136,000, which would bring our total up to 1.28, this would allow us to conduct the neighborhood council elections in a much more comfortable model and a much more reactive and responsive model. And the one last thing I would add is if the committee, council, and mayor would like us to add also the hiring of outside city staff as arbitrators in the post-election period to take care of the challenge review panel process and remove the city clerk entirely from that. That would be your policy call. We estimate a modest charge of $15,500 to add that on. If you add the three components together, the 1.14 for the bare bones, the additional 136 to let us add a regional communication coordinator, ombudsman sort of add-on, and then 15.5 for arbitrators. That brings our total up to 1.3. And this is still well below the amount that was allocated for us last year, and also takes into account that we are going to be taking on more neighborhood councils in 2012 than we did in 2009. And I have my executive officer and my elections chief with me if you have any detailed questions.
In the budget summary letter that you have, there's a 1.315 option to add a comprehensive mailer and media program. So that would be assuming that a significant outreach program were to be conducted prior to the election within the clerk's purview. That would be what that would be for?
Short answer is yes, but Holly will explain.
Okay.
Holly Walcott, Executive Officer, yes, that is correct. It would mean if there were to be 2 outreach mailers to every resident in the city of Los Angeles, then it would cost that.
It's not just 2 mailers, however, it's also multimedia advertisements, public service announcements, something patterned on how local jurisdictions do announce their elections. It's a package, but unfortunately, it is a high price package.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And can you talk a little bit more about the option to add vote by mail, what that would encompass, what would be the mechanics of that would be within that $334,000 option figure?
The bare bones figure of the lower bare bones figure that we started out with does include vote by mail only, however, for people who are disabled or who have a religious preference. If we were to be able to offer comprehensive vote by mail for all the 93 neighborhood councils, the additional cost is nearly $335,000. Arlene, anything else to add?
The cost would go to cover the hiring of as-needed employees to perform the verification function, as well as postage and mailing and supplies necessary for the vote-by-mail process.
So would the mechanics of that basically track the existing vote-by-mail process that we have for municipal elections?
Yes.
I'm just telling you to identify yourself, Easy.
Oh, I'm sorry. Isaias Cantu, Senior Project Coordinator for the Election Division.
Thank you.
Yes.
There may be some people listening who don't recognize all of our voices at this point. So, but the mechanics of it are the same. So it would be with the full verification and an application the ballot is returned, and then that's all that. Okay. So have you considered the possibility and either for feasibility or for cost of alternative vote by mail strategies? For example, downloadable ballots, voting by internet, anything like that would broaden participation and presumably lower cost, albeit, raising questions about verifiability, which, would obviously be the case whenever we try a new voting system. Has there been any consideration of anything like that?
I think you make a valid point when you talk about verification and paper trail when you use PC or electronic voting. These are larger questions that the larger voting community and industry are looking at. But not only that, we have to be absolutely fair that not everybody has access to a PC. So even if we did incorporate electronic voting, we would still have to maintain at-poll voting to be equal to all.
Well, ideally, I would definitely like to go in that direction. The barrier that drives that is you have to register. Is the registration.
The pre-registration factor.
Pre-registration. Right now, on the day of an election, on a neighborhood council election, you show up, you register right there. So without a full registration campaign, it would save money in the out years. It would not save money in the initial year. This may not be the city's financial interest to do it now, although in the long term, I do see some benefit to doing it.
What would be the barriers or potential advantages of having pre-registration of voters in neighborhood council elections?
Well, it's a cost issue up front and an outreach issue initially. If you guys have further you want to...
Yeah, in reference to having a pre-registration process, obviously one of the advantages is that you make it easier for voters to vote on election day because they would be pre-registered. However, some of the questions that come up are related to who would perform that registration process, how it would be available, how often it would be available, the training, if it were to be neighborhood council volunteers to perform that training that would be necessary for doing that, a consistent process for doing it so that you have registration in the harbor that is similar to that being performed in the valley. Those are some of the ones that I can think of.
And I think Arlene Taylor, Chief of the Election Division, another issue would be it would have to be a very complicated system because of the differences in the ways the neighborhood councils elections themselves are structured in terms of requirements, documentation, region, and so forth. So it would have to be a very complicated system that would have to be developed probably in-house. There isn't anything available out there right now that could
So I think it's something
really
we should,
track it at that level.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I think it's something we should continue to look at. I don't think we should ever limit our options in the future, but it's probably not going to be something we were able to do for 2012.
See, I would guess that on the positive side, you're certainly right about the complexity, but the complexity exists inherently in these elections.
Correct.
And so with the status quo, what we have is a situation where resolution of those complex questions about eligibility is done, unfortunately, right then and there as people are voting, or in post-election challenges, which are virtually impossible then to sort out with any kind of a remedy that is going to make any sense and that there's any budget for. So I'm thinking out loud here. This isn't a proposal or anything, but I'm just wondering if there might not be some way that we can minimize the conflict and dispute that happens in the polling place and after the election by having people declare their intent to vote and their basis for voting in advance, so that those things any questions can be sorted out and verified and so on in advance.
How they did it in Honolulu is they started with the county's voting records, but their definition of neighborhood stakeholders are a lot different. So they had all residents. You voted in, it was similar to how you would vote in a municipal election or a state or county election. But our definition of stakeholder is so different. So we could start with residents, but then what do you do for your other types of stakeholders?
I think you hit it on the head. If, in fact, in some neighborhood councils, we had to develop as many as 40, 50, 60 ballot types, Arlene, that would then, arithmetically, you'd be generating that many kinds of registration lists.
I think
because of the unique nature.
A registration process is possible, but I think it would require some changes to the system of how stakeholders are verified. It would be possible if it was fully self-affirmation, at which point the registration process would simply be someone coming in and filling out a form. But when you get into documentation requirement, then it turns a little bit more difficult. And that's just simply for residents. When you start talking about people who work, people who own property, I would assume that you would have to have a whole outreach process just to inform them that when they come to the registration table, whenever that should be, that they should bring certain materials with them. So there's another component that makes it a little bit complicated. But I do think that the diversity can be addressed if some methods of verification are standardized across.
Yeah, and along those lines, all of this discussion presumes that the stakeholder definition and eligibility requirements will remain the same as under the status quo. And that is the case as of now, but as we're talking about all of these policy directions that we're pursuing, it's not out of the question that there may be some sharpening or revisiting of what should be a stakeholder. And I guess, just to confirm that my assumption is right, the costs of this election proposal that you've budgeted out presumes the continuing complexity that comes from having this
Yes.
very wide range of different stakeholder definitions from among the 92 neighborhood councils. So if there were changes in that, presumably that would also bring the cost of elections down as well.
Correct.
Okay.
And as we have indicated before, it is not our place and it is not the jurisdiction of the city clerk to tell neighborhood councils, how they should regulate themselves or write their bylaws. We will conduct an election. We will dispose whatever the neighborhood councils propose. So, we will serve in whatever capacity we can, but the decision is a mayor and council and neighborhood council decision, not ours.
Okay. All right. Very good. Anything else to add to this? All right. I see Mr. Kim has come in, and I'd like to ask if you could come up, Mr. Kim. Okay. All right. Welcome, Mr. Kim. I just now got a letter that you've submitted regarding the clerk's recommendations and budget, but I honestly haven't had a chance even to begin looking at it. So I thought I would give you the opportunity to go ahead and provide whatever comments you'd like on this continuing discussion that we've been having about the neighborhood council elections, what your thoughts are about the appropriate location of the management of those elections, as well as the outreach component preceding the elections.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. B.H. Kim, General Manager, Department of Neighborhood Empowerment, and this follows up on the City Clerk's post-elections report submitted November 10th and addresses our proposal to focus more on the outreach designed to increase awareness and participation in the neighborhood councils. It is my recommendation that the City Clerk administer elections with the department playing a stronger role in outreach and building the visibility of neighborhood councils. The committee has expressed concern about the lack of participation in the elections, and how to address this issue, I agree, is important for the 2012 election cycle. Just as background, you may recall that during the fiscal year 2010 elections, which were held between March and June, the department was undergoing a major shrinking act and were provided with no resources to assist NCs with outreach. Basically, the entire system was left without any resources or any citywide plan for outreach, resulting in much lower turnout. And participation of more people is the lifeblood of the neighborhood council movement. What we would propose, if provided adequate resources, are some key goals for increasing participation. We would identify and recruit new participants. We would raise awareness and increase participation in the neighborhood council elections via various campaigns at the citywide and neighborhood level. We would aim to double the number of candidates running for board seats in 2012. we would aim to increase the number of voters participating in each election, based on the premise that voters and candidate turnout are pretty tightly linked to each other. We would develop and assist neighborhood councils with the use and implementation of outreach toolkits. We would also focus in areas of low civic participation. In our current assessment of neighborhood councils, we find that there are quite a few neighborhood councils in South Los Angeles that are struggling to maintain quorum and participation. So a special focus on low civic participating areas, I would recommend that particular focus be spent there. And lastly, we would mobilize candidate and voter participation through the use of a media campaign, an education, and outreach campaign. So the proposed outreach plan for 2012 is basically a twofold strategy, one focusing on a citywide and regional level, and another one working with individual neighborhood councils. We would create a citywide task force to strategize on how to improve the visibility and increase participation in the system. We would organize a media campaign to ensure that the awareness about the system and elections is raised. We would also launch an information and education campaign whereby the general public would be engaged in this process, such as what we conducted for the prior elections, which was focus groups, learning sessions for the general public. What are the neighborhood councils? Why are they important? Stakeholder orientations and subject matter trainings. And again, development of outreach toolkits, which could include the development of mailing lists that we could provide to neighborhood councils to do their own mailings. We would seek to establish strategic partnerships so that they would not only help us inform the strategy, but they would also help play a part in mobilizing people to participate. Some of those potential partnerships could be elected officials. Obviously, neighborhood councils and regional alliances, the city clerk, city departments, such as Department of Transportation, Sanitation. DWP has a pretty extensive mailing list. Media outlets, both English and ethnic media. Community-based organizations. We would reach out to the unions. We would also reach out to the city employee associations to involve them in neighborhood council participation. I spoke about the task force, but the media campaign would focus both on broadcast media as well as narrowcasting. We would look to tie in with much of the neighborhood council media activity is around more of the community-based newspapers that have smaller circulations. We would look to establish partnerships with them, and many of those media outlets have social media and blogs. And I've had meetings here and there with those types of companies that are covering neighborhood councils, and I think would be enthusiastically embrace a role in promoting the elections. And in targeting areas of low civic participation, we would specifically look towards neighborhood council leaders, community-based organizations, ethnic media, faith-based organizations. At the neighborhood council level, we would work with neighborhood councils to designate funds for elections outreach. Many neighborhood councils do conduct or spend money for outreach. However, it's not particularly focused or targeted to complement the city clerk election. So that would be a role that we would play with the individuals in neighborhood councils. We would nudge the neighborhood councils to form elections and outreach committees to meet key deadlines. As you know, some of the key milestones for elections is candidate information sessions, filing deadlines, and candidate forums. Much of what we heard from neighborhood councils were that the communication wasn't necessarily there, and while some neighborhood councils don't need to be reminded, in our experience, many neighborhood councils need several reminders. Have you done this? Have you done that? And they are often appreciative of having somebody do that kind of nudging to make sure that they're keeping up with what the city is doing. We would train and work with neighborhood councils to conduct their own town halls to raise awareness and recruit candidates. We would also mobilize neighborhood council volunteers to work with neighborhood councils who are requesting outreach assistance. Actually, one of the major programs that we're working on now is a volunteer mentor program to recruit neighborhood councils who are either veterans and current board members who are willing to step up and provide advice to neighborhood councils in special areas of expertise. So in this case, outreach and elections preparations would obviously be a key skill set that neighborhood councils could benefit from. Again, we would develop these outreach toolkits, which we would distribute. And I passed a copy of the outreach manual that we developed for the last elections, which should be in your pile. And if it's not, I think, Erica, if you could. We compiled a resource manual that helped guide the neighborhood councils on the steps to do an outreach campaign and some resources, key resources that they could use. And many of them thought that that was a very useful tool for them to conduct their own outreach. We would identify strategies and toolkits for reaching limited English-speaking populations. And then lastly, we would provide the assistance that we currently provide through our helpline where neighborhood councils could call and get direct assistance. The budget for implementing a citywide outreach and media campaign, we would propose to include 4 positions, 2 NEA-type positions, which are basically field positions, neighborhood empowerment analysts, and 2 management analyst positions to implement the plan. And roughly that cost would be $291,000. We would also request roughly $290,000 for outreach expenses, and that would go directly to the neighborhood councils to pay for distribution and printing. This is based on how we used to run outreach when we were administering elections, where we would designate a certain amount of money. In this case, this would average out to about $3,000 per neighborhood council to provide for those direct expenses. And in conclusion, despite the fiscal crisis that we are currently struggling with, the department is extremely excited to have an opportunity to address a major system-wide need for visibility building, and timed with the elections is a perfect opportunity for us to play that specific role. And it is the right role for the department to play to promote the neighborhood council system. And as you found through your town halls and many of the comments that you received, we should be much less enforcement and much more promotion. And I fully embrace those observations and recommendations. And I think if we are provided the resources and the opportunity that we could fully fulfill that role. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. I think it's a lot of good suggestions about some real grassroots organizing for the outreach, which I think is inherent to this program. So these are interesting suggestions, which I'll look forward to exploring further. On the cost issue, because one of your objectives would be to double the number of candidates, Ms. Lagme, if I'm assuming that the vast majority of the cost that you would propose for the conduct of the election are pretty much fixed costs regardless of the number of voters and the number of candidates. Is that right? So even if we were to have a enormously successful outreach program and vastly increased turnout and increased number of candidates, provided that the number of offices didn't change, your costs would remain pretty much the same. Maybe a slight variation, but it would be very slight, I would think.
For the record, let me just say that Bongwan and my goals are absolutely the same. We are both interested in the success of the neighborhood council system and the success of their elections. So I'm very looking forward to partnering with BH in that way. To answer your question, it's unknown. We'll just have to monitor the situation. If we see a groundswell of support and activity and mobility, we will continue monitoring our figures. If we need to come back for more funds, we may need to. Our figures are based on a good average range of what, a low to a high, very similar to how we project costs for handling municipal elections. And I think that we will probably be fine with the amount that we have, but I can't promise it. Holly?
The only costs that would vary might be printing costs. If you had a larger increase in the number of polling sites, if you had a greater increase of the number of voters, but you might not know that until the day of, but again, I'm with June. I think it would be probably incrementally. I think it's safe to assume that it doesn't, that the increase all around would be a good thing without a budget impact that we couldn't handle.
Great. Okay. Thank you both very much. We've had a extensive, long discussion about these issues over the course of many meetings, and I don't want to keep having you come back for further discussion. We're not going to move forward with a recommendation today, but I do want to note and file this report. And then as we continue to develop the surrounding policies in this area as part of the package of policy recommendations that I'm going to be making, we will be making recommendations relating both to the operation of the elections and the outreach and its potential budget implications. And we'll be doing that over the course of, well, I don't want to pin myself down to a time, but over the course of the next number of meetings and months as we move into the budget season. We'll be working on that in this committee, but for now, I want to note and file this report. Thank you both very much for your input and for your very thorough analysis of the experience that we've had so far. So,
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you,
Chair.
Mr. Chair.
thank you very much, and that will bring us to public comment. And I think everyone is here to speak on this item, so let's start with Doug Eberhardt. And 2 minutes, please. And after Mr. Eberhardt will be Jeff Jacobberger.
Okay, good
Welcome.
Good afternoon, Councilman. I have a communication here from myself and Robert Gelfand. There's a bunch of copies. Essentially offering to involve the neighborhood councils in this. We were the leaders of the bylaws task force that was in existence earlier this year. I'm the co-chairman of the bylaws resource team, which is actually beginning the work now of working with neighborhood councils to raise the standards of their bylaws and help them do a better job. Some of this, I think, will be addressed in that process. A couple of things. I would point out that the 21,623 neighborhood council voters probably cost the city about $60 to $70 apiece. In the past, we ran very good neighborhood council elections, and I would say the average cost for a voter was probably $10. And that was at a time that the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment was doing 2 walking man distributions throughout every neighborhood council area. We have done this much, much cheaper. We can do this much, much cheaper. I appreciate what the city clerk has said. I appreciate what Bangwan has said. And frankly, I think about 25% of it is actually valuable. We do not need, as a city, to pay this amount of money per neighborhood council voter. We can do better. And I think if you consult with the neighborhood councils, if we put a group together to look at what the real goals are here, we can come up with something better and cheaper. I can tell you that the biggest factor in causing a much lower turnout in my neighborhood council was the fact that we had an election on a Tuesday afternoon instead of a Saturday all day, which is when we used to do them. I mean, that far outranks outreach and all of the rest of it. It's something that simple. And so those are the things I think we need to take a long look at and maybe change if we can. I could talk about this forever, but we'll probably have a conversation later, I'm sure. Thank you.
And for the sake of the record, I think it's safe to say that there's probably nobody who's ever involved the neighborhood councils more in this policy making than but I do appreciate your comments, and we will continue to. So thank you very much. Mr. Jacobberger,
Yep.
followed by Glenn Bailey.
Jeff Jacobberger, I'm the chair of the Mid-City West Community Council. I was on the Neighborhood Council Review Commission. I think the fundamental thing we have to keep in mind is that the goal is maximizing participation in neighborhood councils. And, my concern when I hear things about pre-registration and things like that is that it's a tool that is, in effect, will completely diminish and eviscerate participation in neighborhood council elections. We should be reducing hurdles to participation, not erecting additional hurdles. When I was on the Neighborhood Council Review Commission, my primary goal was having uniform election procedures. When you ran for the Assembly, when you ran for City Council, you did not have to worry about what the election procedures for your election were going to be. You just had to focus on getting people to turn out and support you. And the problem now with a whole bunch of different menus of neighborhood councils is neighborhood councils are spending most of their time and effort on figuring out what election procedures they're wanting and going through a 30-page checklist from the city clerk or Dunn or whoever it is, instead of just tell us the rules, develop some rules that will maximize participation and give them to us. And I guess my personal feeling is a lot of the rules that neighborhood councils want to put about pre-registration, about verification and stuff, are really about some group of people in a community sort of deciding that other stakeholders in the community really shouldn't have a voice. And I think that's a really dangerous thing. My neighborhood council, we have 45 board members. Our neighborhood includes, we've traditionally held our elections at the farmers market, just in the middle, out in the open. If there was any neighborhood council that would have been susceptible to manipulation and just random people showing up and voting, it would be ours, and it just does not happen. Just one last thing real quickly about using Walking Man to deliver. When the city clerk did the election in the last round, they did direct mail. When we did our election this year, we did direct mail. My neighborhood is 80% renters. Walking Man cannot get into multifamily buildings. When we did direct mail, we got a different kind of candidate running for the board, and we have a very different board that is, in my view, much more representative of the community rather than distribution that in effect only goes to single-family homes.
Thank you. All right, our next speaker is Glenn Bailey, followed by Jim McQuiston. Mr. Bailey, welcome.
Glenn Bailey. I'm a board member on the Encino Neighborhood Council, but however, I'm speaking as an individual. First of all, for my experience over all the elections since we were certified, vote by mail was an important component of participation and turnout. And to me, if there's any focus, it ought to be on that. It doesn't necessarily have to cost the city. We just have to make the forms available. And I don't know if you could require pre-stamped envelope. I don't know, but not having that this last election, I think, was seriously impacted the voter participation with our neighborhood council. The voter pre-registration, to me, the only rationale for that is only if you're going to do online voting. In terms of outreach, my understanding is that in every single certification neighborhood council, outreach was a required inclusion in the bylaws. Every neighborhood council has to have an outreach committee. So I think the challenge is to make sure that it functions as outreach/election committee to really do as a partner, whether it's Dunn or city clerk or both, all three. I think the neighborhood councils have stepped up to the plate a big time for that outreach responsibility, and that's not paid people from the two departments. In the last election, as an example of how communication being improved, the Greater Toluca Lake Neighborhood Council, everything was documented, but it wasn't communicated adequately. So they advertised the election times differently than what was agreed to 6 months, 9 months earlier. And as a matter of fact, when the region worked to put the newspaper ad in the Daily News, they were included with the times with the other neighborhood councils, even though their time was different. And if there had been some Dunn or city clerk, I guess in this case, city clerk presence in that participation, or in Mr. Kim's proposal, which sounds good to me, a Dunn presence, maybe mistakes like that could be avoided, so that there's communication across the various councils and regions. Lastly, if I may, the write-in deadline for, if you really want to increase candidates and participate, and therefore participation, you really need to think more, use voter-friendly, neighborhood council-friendly regarding the write-in candidate deadline. It was 30 days prior to the election. And nobody, it was difficult to know how to fill vacant seats because the information wasn't released so that you could like maybe file for a seat that was open. In other words, there were some people who filed for one if they've known that it was no one else filed. And also the write-in deadline, there's really no reason, to my mind, you can ask that, why it had to be so far in advance of the election. I mean, it's not, the name's not on the ballot, it's a line that's going to be there regardless. And as long as they have it, I think, a few days before the election, in case somebody found out about the election during the outreach process and say, oh, there's an open seat, or there's only one person running, make it easier. And that would, and lastly, the volunteer poll workers. Ask, in my opinion, ask how much it costs to have the polls staffed by city clerk on election day of 100% city clerk staff, as opposed if it was one IEA or one city clerk person overseeing the volunteer poll workers like we used to do when we had the elections. We were 100% volunteers. Okay. And also the training for those volunteer poll workers needs to be conveniently regionally. It was all downtown, right, not convenient for the valley. I know. Okay. All right, thanks.
All right, Mr. McQuiston. And then Mr. Bailey, you're back up for public comments.
Jim McQuiston, you have my long statement this time. The reason I made it so long was because I wanted to bring up, not because I wanted to say I told you so, but there is a lot of information that can be distilled together from that statement. You heard people talking about, well, we have to get out to residents. Well, we have to circulate better. Well, maybe we should get on the internet or something like that. But the charter says that people who live, work, or own property in the neighborhood, those people are not being addressed. And why do we say that? The reason we say that is if those people are having difficulty with the city in the delivery of services, they are part of the neighborhood council, even if they're not elected, and they can insist that they have a hearing or a meeting with the responsible officials. And if they don't respond, the city has given money to the neighborhood councils, which supposedly then you could go to your fellows and say, look, we have to have a meeting and decide if we want to hire a lawyer and go after the city on this particular problem. And that is where neighborhood councils have a value to the city. Actually spending all this money on elections is just so much wasted money as far as the city is concerned. We have a problem in ITA because they can't service the computers now. They don't have enough people. We're really in a serious budget shortfall where the city cannot do what it really wants to do as far as delivering services. And this is no time to talk about anything unless the people themselves say, I am going to get out and I'm going to look over my neighborhood and I'm going to call up on trees that need to be trimmed or fire hydrants that are broken or vandalism around. And if people don't respond to me, we do have this energy to get things done. And unless that happens, we're wasting our time on things like that.
Thank you. I well understand that we're facing budget constraints, and I think this is the balance that we're all striving to reach, because the truth is neighborhood councils are not homeowners associations. They're not chambers of commerce. They're not the improvement association. They are the elected representatives of neighborhoods, and they have a role in the governance of this city.
But they're not elected representatives.
I get it, but they are. They are elected representatives who are, representing their community.
But not what the charter
I don't want to get into a
says.
dialogue, Mr. McQuiston. I'm just giving you my thoughts, and then we're going to go to Mr. Bailey. And so we have a balance to strike between having legitimacy in elections and having, I think the gravitas for neighborhood councils that they deserve, while at the same time not wanting to open up the bank and wasting money that we don't need to waste on elections, which could better be spent on services. It is a difficult balance to strike. I appreciate that, and I think everybody is trying to hit that balance, and that's what we're going to continue to work toward. Okay, thank you. Mr. Bailey.
Glenn Bailey, I'll deduct the time I went over from my public comment time.
I'll let you do two one last things on this one.
First of all, I'd like to publicly commend Councilmember Krikorian and his staff for the 2 town hall meetings that you held, one in Van Nuys and one at USC. I went to both, and I thought they were well organized and very productive. Thank you very much.
For being there.
Hopefully you will consider, as it's needed, to do future ones. My public comment has to do with really outreach as it relates to this whole process. And it relates to this committee, and it relates to the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners. And it concerns the council phone system, which, as you may know, has been down for 2 months. It was down totally for a couple of weeks, and then they somehow patched it that you can only use it for city council meetings live, but you cannot access this committee. And you cannot. Has nothing to do with you, or
it's actually news to me. So
okay, well that's why I'm here. That's why I'm here, because I haven't been able to get to your meetings, but I have tried to listen to them using the council phone, and it's not functioning. And the same thing with Bonk, which also meets when it's not meeting out in the neighborhoods, it's meeting in this floor, and the same thing where you cannot listen to the meetings. This is a lot of neighborhood council folks, may not be able to come down for a bonk at 11:30 on a Monday, or even to this committee at 3:30, but they would listen via council phone. Now, this committee audio is on the city's website, so you can listen to it after the fact, or if you have high speed, you can listen to it live. But bonk is not. And it's very frustrating when you want to hear how things are being developed or discussed, not to have that access. So I am bringing that to your attention, requesting your attention to see. And obviously I've made contacts with ITA. I've made contacts with Al Abrams and with the Bonk Commission person and all that. But they're not in charge of the technology. But maybe they might respond more to you. Thank you.
I appreciate you raising it. We'll follow up on it. Thank you. We're always looking for new ways to make this stuff more accessible, so at the least we should do is make what is supposed to be happening actually happen. So thank you. Oh, did you want to comment?
For clarification, Councilman, you wanted to note and file all the reports on this file at this point?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. With that, we're adjourned. Thank you all. Maybe we aren't. Are we, Mr. Powell? Or did you have? You had a concerned look. I thought.
City clerk's report? No.
Yeah, we're noting and filing it.
Okay. Sorry.
Okay.
It's been one of those weeks.